Capital and Community by Jacques Camatte. Publisher's Preface. The text has been around for 6 years in photocopy form. Unfortunately, only a few copies have been produced, and we feel it deserves to be more widely read. It is a heavy read as it deals with complex arguments in some of Marx's writings. It particularly relates to the quandaries and the immediate process of production, both of which have only been available since the 70s. These texts show how shallow the outlook of the Marxists of the Second and Third International and their acolytes are. However, we have no desire to try and drag Marx out of the mire of leftism, a task which certainly economists have attached importance to. From our own studies of Marx, it can clearly be seen that he had many weaknesses. Eurocentrism, German chauvinism. I'm sorry to make a comment so early on, but I've literally have posted Reddit comments saying this, and the people telling me this text have made fun of them, but here's their favorite book just saying it in the first paragraph. That's really funny to think about. In other words, he was a human, all too human. We regard the search for pure Marx and the pure interpretation of Marx to be a fool's errand, formulated by those who seek a new Moses with tablets of proletarian truth. This is exactly how Bordiga describes Marx, exactly, including with this imagery, to the specific level of specificity. So, that's another interesting thing in this. Which merely need to be unearthed and scrubbed clean before being presented to the class. Such fetishization of a historical figure can only obscure the fact that communism is a product of the class struggle, not of an individual mind. Marx made a substantial contribution to the communist movement, but he did not invent it. We reject the notion that Marxism is somehow essential to the communist movement. However, Marx's contribution is an irreversible historical fact. His contribution was made in the material context of his time with all its limitations. We equally dismiss anti-Marxism as being equally perverse as Marxism. Both avoid centering the question of communism on the proletariat. Okay, so they're just breaking with Marxism. Alright. We're only 2 minutes in, we've broken with Marxism, wow. Attentive readers will notice a substantial variation of viewpoint between the main text, written in the mid-60s, and the notes added in 72. Yeah, I am noticing it, yeah. Those familiar with the writings of Camatte will be aware of his shift during that period, during particular influence by the events of May 68. In particular, Camatte came to deny the central role of class. This we cannot go along with. I'm shocked. While it is undeniable that the formation of political classes have gone through substantial change as capital has developed, we cannot agree that they have been dissolved by the tyranny of capital. Earlier formulations of class have been male-centered and... I'm skipping this. I'm skipping the preface. Camatte. Preface to the French edition, Capital and Community. This was to have been the title of the Italian translation of the following text, the unpublished 6th chapter of Capital and the economic work of Marx, with the additional notes of 1972 theses on capitalism, a proposed capital, about the Revolution 1972. The publishers, Daedalus, thought otherwise, and they've appeared instead under the title Il Capitolo Totale. Even if it is true that Marx researched into the becoming of capital as totality, that in no way exhausts the study that he made of capital. One cannot leave out all that concerns the opposition between total capital and particular capital, and the fact that, even when it has reached totality, capital can only live by particularizing itself, by differentiating itself into a large number of capital quanta. The fact that capital is erected as a material community allows capital to avoid losing itself in all the various processes. This community flourishes on the dead and reified, but with the movement of anthropomorphosis, capital becoming man, its community possesses as geminalizing. Thus, men are snared by being they themselves produced. This again requires the opposition statement. The human being is the true geminalizing community of man, Marx proclaimed in the Origin and Function of the Party form. That Marx is in parentheses, and leaflet on May 68 movement in the proletariat and Geminweisen. Marx considered the proletariat as being the class that was able to allow the setting up of true Geminweisen, hence the profoundly human dimension of the proletarian revolution, a revolution in the name of humanity. He also provided many indications of capital becoming Geminweisen. This is what we took up again by trying to push the analysis to the limit with respect to the recent developments of capital. This study was undertaken well before 1961 and was published in Invariance Series 2, number 2 to 6, as well as in the text below. Even if Marx's work is now operational, it can consider, however, what we wrote on the human community remains fundamental. We are always confronted with the realization of capital as Gemenweisen and the possibility of the true Gemenweisen of man, the human being. But instead of conceiving them as antagonists, which would imply that the latter has to oppose the former, we state that the former community is only realization if men and women abandon the world of capital. The material community has become the community for men to the extent that capital is representation. It is not the socio-economic substrate of their life. It is also their ideology. Men and women must break with this representation. This will allow them to undertake a different dynamic. Besides, if there are cracks in the base, that is, inside the material community, they will all the more easily be able to question and reject the representation of capital. The break with capital can neither be only passive determined, nor totally voluntary. That is why it is still necessary to deepen the mode of being of capital so as to be able to escape it in the study in what it may consist the human being, the true Gemenweisen of men and women. Introduction. One has to establish a chronology of Marx's work on economics in order to understand the importance of this unpublished chapter of Capital. All the more so because Marx was unable to complete this work. It is vital to discover the common framework, the central preoccupation on which all the works are oriented. Marx himself indicated the line of their development. He speaks in the preface to the contribution to the critique of political economy of the starting point provided by Engels' brilliant sketch of the critique of the categories of political economy. This had come ready-made, so as to speak. Marx had already shown that the different developments of human activity had one and the same basis, economic production, that on the mode of production depended all other manifestations of human activity, thought in particular. Instead of studying the human consciousness as an independent product, one had to understand the real human life processes. This reversal is given in an extraordinarily concise form in the famous thesis on Feuerbach, but it was in the German ideology that he elaborated the method which was clearly and precisely defined as historical materialism in the preface to the contribution. He attempts to demonstrate the new theory in this work, to prove that the economic and social factors are the determining ones. This is why it both contains an initial sketch of what later becomes the introduction to the critique of political economy, an exposition on the method and plan of the entire work, and outlines the forms that precede capitalist production, the periodization of human history. This was in perfect coherence with the doctrine, history is the only true science. The study did not see the light of day as a definitive work. It was abandoned to the knowing criticism of mice. Marx and Engels were not excessively attached to it, but its elaboration had allowed them, above all, to attain clarity with the new framework and to master the new theory. Meanwhile, Marx worked actively on a study on economics, which Engels mentioned in a letter dated to January 20th, 1845. See that you finish soon your book on political economy, even if you still should be dissatisfied with much. Marx also mentions the same subject in a letter to Lesk. Through a friend of the gentleman, the publication of my critique of political economy was moreover as good as assured. This too remained unpublished during the author's lifetime. It was published after the death of the two friends and translated into English as Economic and Philosophical Manuscripts of 1844. For all that, Marx did not abandon his economic studies. In 1847 had published The Poverty Philosophy in reply to Proudhon. This is, in a sense, a resume of the preceding work. It concludes the Critique of Philosophy in the same terms which it had been conducted in the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Law and on the Jewish question. It is the proletariat that emancipates human society. Further, here he describes the real movement of this emancipation, the class constituting itself as party. This implies a precise definition of this society and a characterization of future society. 1847 is also the year of the manifesto of the Communist Party. The workers' movement had to have its program, especially as this movement was increasing, as Marx described in The Poverty Philosophy. The manifesto condenses the essence of all the worker struggles in the past, both theoretically and practically, and illuminates it with the plain and clear affirmation of communism, but communism stripped of all utopianism, because it is presented for what it is, the real movement of society, of the proletariat towards its emancipation. Marx's economic works are not at all academic, but meant for the proletariat to serve as weapons for its struggle. Thus, in 1849, he condensed the results of his research into a series of conferences held in Bruxelles, Wage, Labor, and Capital. When the revolutionary wave ebbed, Marx resumed the great economic work that he had undertaken, but as we've already noted, has been unable to publish at the proper moment before the revolution. The program, launched in 1847, needed an unshakable basis. Marx continued his study, and in 1859 published a contribution to the critique of political economy. This was to mark the starting point of an extremely large work that he would have preferred to have published as a whole in one chunk. However, he was forced to speed up its publication because of the economic stupidities being spread by many socialist propagandists. Lassalle in particular. The work especially dealt with value during simple commodity circulation and during the transformation of money into capital, but it was too dense and synthetic. Marx wanted simultaneously to provide the critique of the base and superstructure, an explanation of the real phenomena and the theories derived, what was to become the theories of surplus value. It is the same time as an exposé of the system and through the exposé of critique of it. Hence the double plan of the work. Exposition of the economic phenomena and a critique of different theories put forward concerned with phenomena being studied. It was probably due to the over-dialectal exposition, flirt with Hegel, that the contribution was unsuccessful. Capital appeared when the labor movement was on the upsurge, and two of the largest sinners at the time, Germany and France. The exposition is more didactic and constitutes the real program of the proletariat for its emancipation. One could say it was claimed by the working class, which needed a critical and constructive arm for its daily struggle against capital, and the wider struggle leading to capital's destruction. This is the meaning of Marx's exposition to the IWMA at more or less the same time called Wages, Price, and Profit. As is known, only Capital Volume 1 was published in the author's lifetime. The two other volumes were published by Engels, but he too was unable to complete publication of the work, and a large quantity of manuscripts were left over. Kautsky issued the equivalent of the fourth volume, Theories of Surplus Value. There still remained the Gradries published in Germany just before the Second World War, the results of the immediate process of production, and certainly many other works, especially on the agrarian question. The study of all these works shows that Marx confronted the critique of political economy in four different ways. The first is that of the economic and philosophical manuscripts. Wage labor is the basis of capitalist society. Since capital is merely objectified labor, Marx explains all the alienation about which Hegel wrote all history is the product of human labor. Not only of the theoretical intellectual labor, but also of the labor of real human activity. Alienation exists in practical life, in real life. It derives from the fact that man has become a commodity in bourgeois society. However, Marx remains largely on the enemy's terrain, in the sense that, like the philosophers and therefore Hegel, he confronts the problem starting from man, from the subject, while the question is, how is the subject itself produced? This also explains why he speaks first of wages, then of capital and landed property, going on later to analyze property in bourgeois society and in communist society. To some extent, therefore, it is the opposite to what he will do later. My analytical method, which does not start from man, but from the economically given period of society, has nothing in common. The procedure is therefore still subjective. It is true that man lies at the center of the problem, not man as an isolated individual, but rather social man, the human species. This being already a refutation of the bourgeois position, but one must also show the economic conditions that produce him. It was still too much just a simple refutation of Hegel. Now man can only be the subject in communist society. In class society, he is alienated and therefore an object. Whether one is dealing with a proletarian or a bourgeois, it simply means that capital is the subject. He who was previously the money owner now strides out in front of the capitalist. The possessor of labor power follows as his worker. The one smirks self-importantly and is intent on business. The other is timid and holds back, like someone who has brought his own hide to market and now has nothing else to expect but a tanning. The importance of the manuscripts lies in the fact that they registered the birth certificate of communism. In the polemic with the economists, Marx discovers the future form of society, just as he had seen it, felt in his struggle against Hegel's philosophy, and on the Jewish question, but now goes further, because he defines its economic base. The second way of confronting the critique of political economy is that provided by the contribution, and by capital, Marx starts with something that can easily be established, the commodity, as Lenin says, so as to be able to introduce the problem of value, its different forms, and then return to a simple commodity circulation and the appearance of capital. Wage labor, inasmuch as it produces surplus value, then appears to explain the genesis of capital, the genesis of the increase in value, without which no formation of capital can occur. This is done by analyzing the immediate process of production. What I start from is the simplest social form in which the labor product is represented in contemporary society, and this is the commodity. I analyze this, and indeed, first in the form which it appears. The third way ends in the fragment of the original version, Urtext, of the contribution to the critique of political economy. Marx confronts the problem in the most general way possible, the birth of value, and poses the question, how can value achieve autonomy, an established fact in bourgeois society, ceasing to be strictly dependent on the conditions of that generated it? The fourth and last way to be found in the chapter of the Gundries, forms which precede capital's production. Capital can only develop on conditions that it frees man and makes him into a commodity, but to do so it has to destroy the various communities which encompass him, which were governed in a more or less debased way by an economy in which man was the aim of production. In a certain sense, this means the study of the obstacles which hindered capital's development, the social inertia caused by the various communities, most especially in the Asiatic mode of production, which still survives in India, for example, and makes the economic development of that country so difficult. The result of the immediate process of production lies where these various methods of exposition converge, and just for this reason, allows us to understand the entire work. In a way, it provides a key, not to understand capital, which is self-sufficient, but the entire work surrounding it. It allows one to establish a connection between works with no seeming interrelationship. It shows the absolute coherence of the whole theory. All the works that have been mentioned are really only fragments of a single one. May seem that Marx had different preoccupations, different ways of confronting one and the same problem, because his work could not be published in its entirety. His different plans are illuminating in this respect. Marx provides a simple modification of the economic and philosophic manuscript plans in the contribution for the reasons given in the observation about this work. In the preface to the contribution, he writes, I examined the system of bourgeois economy in the following order: capital, landed property, wage labor, the state, foreign trade, world market. The economic conditions of the existence of the three great classes into which modern bourgeois society is divided are analyzed under the first three headings. The interconnected of the other three headings is self-evident. This is the same as the plan sent to Engels. Marx provides an even more detailed plan in Notebook 18 of 1862, although the fundamental points for the subdivision of the work are identical. Marx indicates the combination of absolute and relative surplus value, productive and unproductive labor, under point 5. Elsewhere in the sketch of the plan in 1859, he subdivides the study of the same process in the following ways. 1. The transformation of money into capital. Alpha, transition. Beta, exchange between capital and labor power. Gamma, the labor process. G, the valorization process. Points Y, G are the first two to be considered in the results. Consequently, this test must be analyzed in conjecture with the other texts mentioned in order to make a correct appraisal. Two main questions emerge from all these works, be they completed or as plans in the sketch. 1. The origin of value, its characteristics and forms. 2. The origin of the free worker, the wage laborer. We shall deal with them in this order and analyze the consequences they imply. The forms of value and the definition of capital. This was the central concern of political economy, long before its development as an independent science. A clear reply could only emerge after the facts themselves had been clarified. In other words, it could only appear at a certain level of generalization of the mercantile economy. First, men had to have a clear insight into the economic relations determining their material life. Marx, too, encountered several difficulties, not so much in grasping what determines value, socially necessary labor time, but in giving this an historical exposition. That is to say, the forms of value with all the consequences deriving from them. Marx elaborated the theory of surplus value quite alone and in silence during the 50s, and he utterly refused to publish any of it until he had fully clarified all the consequences. Hence, the non-publication of the second and subsequent books of the contribution. We know that Marx wrote Capital instead. While it was being edited, Engels suggested some modifications. In these rather abstract elaborations, you have committed the great mistake of not making the sequence of thought clear by a large number of small subsections and separate headings. Marx took this into account and included in the appendix the form of value in the first German edition. It is for this reason that Capital Volume 1 contains an intelligible exposition of the whole matter. However, many of the consequences Engel mentioned in his letter to Shemulov have never been analyzed. Thus, one must first summarize what Volume 1 has to say on the subject. A. The contribution of capital, Volume 1. In the course of history, all the products of human activity, even those merely filtered through labor, become commodities, while a parallel process makes one commodity into a general equivalent against which all other commodities are measured. This is gold, money. This means that exchange value progressively becomes the dominant factor, displacing the use value of the products of human activity. Such a transformation presupposes the simultaneous transformation of concrete into abstract labor. That is, products progressively lose their characteristic of being the result of the particular activity of man, to take on that of being a product of human labor. At this level of generalization of commodity production, man himself becomes a commodity, the labor power which can sell itself, and it is this particular commodity which generates surplus value, through its consumption in the production process. This happens in the following way. The capitalist, who owned the means of production, assure the existence of the worker. A person expropriated of his own means of production, reduced to the state of absolute dependence, since he is the master of nothing except his own labor power, which can only be effective and so real when he comes into contact with the means of labor which are in the possession of the capitalist. The latter consents to give him wages, i.e., a certain quantity of money, allowing him to buy on the market, owned by the capitalist, the means of subsistence necessary to maintain his material life, on the condition that the worker alienates his labor power, which the capitalist will use as he wishes, according to the requirements of the production process itself. Now the origin of surplus value is quite clear. The use of labor power generates more products than are necessary to reproduce it. This first form of surplus value is absolute surplus value. It derives from the prolongation of the maximum of the time during which labor power is used, with the purpose of creating the largest possible quantity of products. Prolongation of the working day in order to increase the fraction of the worker works unpaid for the benefit of the capitalist. The struggle of the proletariat against the unchecked exploitation engendered by this striving for absolute surplus value forces the capitalists to introduce machines, docile instruments. At this point, the extraction of surplus value is performed indirectly by increasing the productivity of labor. The machine, above all, subjugates man, as he had already been described in the economic and philosophic manuscripts. The machine accommodates itself to the weakness of the human being in order to make the weak human being into a machine. Besides, the machine causes a considerable increase in productivity of labor. A greater quantity of products is generated by the same quality of labor. The unit value of the product is diminished, and in particular, that of the means of subsistence required by the worker. The commodities produced by capital contain decreasing amounts of paid labor. The working day can thus stay unchanged, since the fraction of it that the worker works to reproduce his own wages is diminished. Given that the sum of value of the means of subsistence required for this subsistence diminishes too. Direct physical coercion gives way to indirect economic coercion. For it to be exercised with the certainty implies capital's domination over all the mechanisms of the economy, with the scope of being able to exert this overall pressure. It is done in such a way that the proletariat can do nothing except submit or die of hunger. Capital also subordinates science, and not just to incorporate in the production process, but also as a theoretical weapon, to show that that production cannot take place in any other manner. B. The contribution of the Urtext. Marx vigorously and decisively exposes the secret of capitalist production, the exploitation of the proletariat. He explains the genesis of surplus value, and refuting the economists who want to posit capital as the eternal form of production, shows that capital is a social relation, but the epigonic capital can maintain their theory as they reason from appearance, because, although it is thus correct to say that exchange value is a relation between persons, it is, however, necessary to add that it is a relation hidden by a material veil. This relation is masked all the more as exchange value, born in the sphere of commodity circulation, becomes increasingly autonomous. This is what Marx's analysis in the fragment of the original version of the contribution, the Urtext. Although the concept of autonomization appears in other texts, only here does it lie at the heart of the explanation. In the Grundriss, Marx uses it as a concept he has already acquired and defined it in other works. Likewise in the Contribution and in Capital. Hence the interest in the Urtext. It opens with the analysis of the forms of value, like capital. He starts from the simple form, X commodity, A equals Y, commodity B, going on to the more developed form, the money form, making clear what is essential in the circulation. It is through circulation that commodities are brought together, compared, and thus become equivalents. Gold is a commodity distinct from wheat, and the only circulation can show whether the quarter of wheat is actually turned into an ounce of gold, as has been anticipated in its price. Commodities must enter the exchange process as objectified universal labor time. On the other hand, the labor time of individuals becomes objectified universal labor time only as a result of the exchange process. The material veil really appears as circulation. It is during the circulation that value is realized and its autonomization takes place. For this reason, the first economists saw in circulation the essential moment in value creation. But this is false, as we know, from the explanation of the classical economists, and of Marx in particular. The increase in value is realized in the sphere of circulation, but arises in the sphere of production. Marx adopts the starting point of the fact of the appearance of the phenomena. He shows it in its becoming, explains the contradiction that it implies, and succeeds by analyzing these in grasping the secret of the real movement. Hence, money, as distinct from the medium of circulation, must be derived from CMC, the immediate form of commodity circulation. The first phase of circulation is, as it were, a theoretical phase preparatory to real circulation. Commodities, which exist as use values, must first of all assume a form in which they appear to be one another nominally as exchange values, as definite quantities of objectified universal labor time. The first necessary move in this process is, as we have seen, that the commodity sets apart a specific form, say gold, which becomes the direct materialization of universal labor time, or the universal equivalent. This is the beginning of the autonomization of exchange value, but for this to be fully realized, gold must be a variable quantity which can be used as a measure of value. Gold must be, in principle, a variable value. It is to serve as a measure of value, because only as materialization of labor time can it become the equivalent of other commodities. In fact, gold can perform this function, and Marx makes a long analysis of precious metals as the basis of the monetary function. Gold can function as equivalent for all commodities, and for any individual part of them whatsoever, hence its autonomization and magical character. Once he arrives at this stage of analysis, Marx studied the limits to the autonomization of money and the conditions which allow exchange value to become really autonomous. This opens the way to studying the transition from money to capital. The circulation has as a starting point the two determinations of the commodity, use value and exchange value. If the former predominates, circulation ends in the autonomization of use value. The commodity becomes an object of consumption. If the latter, circulation ends in the second determination, the autonomization of the exchange value. The commodity becomes money, but it only assumes this determination through the process of circulation, and it continues to be determined in relation to circulation. In this determination, it develops further an objectified universal labor time in its social form. It is from this side that the further determination of social labor, which first appears as exchange value of the commodity, then as money, must arise. Exchange value is a social form as such. Its further development is therefore the development of, or the deepening in the social process, which throws the commodity onto its surface. Here, Marx deals with the transformation of money into capital, the circulation of which will realize the opposite of the circulation of commodities. In the movement CMC, the material appears as the intrinsic content of the movement, the social movement only as a vanishing mediation to satisfy human needs. The commodity becomes value, and hence autonomous exchange value. To explain the autonomization, exchange value must be analyzed in greater detail. As previously we took the commodity as our starting point, we now take exchange value as such. Its autonomization is a result of the circulation process. We find that 1. Exchange value exists doubly, as commodity and as money. The latter appears as its adequate form, but in the commodity, as long as it remains a commodity, the money is not lost, but exists as its price. The existence of exchange value is thus doubled. Once its use values, then in money, but both the forms may be exchanged, and through mere exchange the value does not diminish. 2. For money to preserve itself as money, it must, just as it appears as a precipitate in the result of the circulation process, be able to re-enter it, i.e. not become a circulation, mere means of circulation, which disappear in commodity form in exchange for mere use value. This exchange value can only become autonomous as a process no longer as a mere vanishing form of use value, indifferent to the use value's material content, still a mere thing, in the form of money. But at this point, circulation itself undergoes some changes, and it is no longer as a merely formal process in which the commodity passes through its various determinations, as in the case of simple commodity circulation, but exchange value itself. Moreover, exchange value measured in money must appear as a presupposition itself, as posited by circulation, and as posited by circulation its presupposition. Circulation itself must appear as a movement of the production of exchange value, as the process of production of exchange value. The contradiction which is implied by the circulation of money is now posed, a contradiction which led the economists to make a mistake. They reason from the apparent phenomena. Apparently, in fact, we are confronted by a relation between things which are in the sphere of circulation. Then it is seen at a given moment that the value has increased. Let us follow Marx's analysis, which will enable us to unveil the mystification of things. This valorization, quantitative increase of value, which is the only process which value as such can perform, appears in money accumulation only in opposition to circulation, i.e. through its suspension. Circulation must rather be posited as the process where value is preserved and valorized, but in circulation, money becomes coin, and as such is exchanged with commodities. In other words, circulation must grow. Circulation must in some way contain a productive phase, in the course of which valorization takes place, i.e. the growth of value. Marx then states the characteristics of this circulation and the conditions which allow value to attain autonomy. 1. If this changes is not merely to be merely formal, or if the exchange value is not to be lost in consumption of the commodity, then exchange value must really be exchanged for use value, and the commodity must be consumed as use value, but preserve itself as exchange value in this consumption, or its disappearance must disappear, and itself be only the means of arising of a greater exchange value. Hence the definition of the commodity as the product of capital is anticipated. For the production and reproduction of exchange value, productive consumption, consumption through labor, in order to objectify labor, deposit exchange value. 2. To become autonomous, exchange value must not only leave circulation as a result, but it must not be able to re-enter it, to preserve itself in it, when it becomes a commodity. 3. Moreover, it cannot be the question of a simple quantitative movement as in the case of money. As the former universal wealth, autonomized exchange value, money incapable only of a quantitative movement to increase itself. According to its concept, it is the quintessence of all use values, but as an amount of money that is always determined, a determined sum of gold and silver, its quantitative barrier is in contradiction with its quality. 4. As long as money, i.e. autonomized exchange value, only preserves itself against its opposite, use value as such, it is in fact capable only of abstract existence. It must preserve itself in its opposite, in its becoming use value, and at the same time grow as exchange value, i.e. the consumption of this use value generates exchange value, and therefore there cannot be indifference with regards to the quality of this use value. Thus it must transform the consumption of use value, its active negation and likewise position, into the reproduction and production of exchange value itself. In this case, which exchange value can completely fulfill these functions in these conditions? Capital. The movement which is made autonomous and results from circulation as adequate exchange value, but which re-enters circulation and perpetuates itself and valorizes itself multiple times in it and through it, is capital. After this definition, derived from the study of circulation and autonomous exchange value, Marx characterized capital. 1. The imperishability of which money aspires, relating negatively to circulation, withdrawing from it, is attaining by capital precisely by the fact that it abandons itself to circulation. Capital, as the exchange value presupposing circulation, is presupposed by it in preserving itself and it assumes in turn, the two movements contained in simple circulation, but it does not transfer from one form to the other, as in simple circulation, but in each of the determinations is at the same time the relation with the opposite. 2. It is not this or that commodity, but can become metamorphosed into every commodity, and in every one of these it continues to be the same amount of value, and to be value in relation to itself as an end in itself. 3. Besides, it is no longer loses in circulation, since it passes from its form as money into that of any commodity whatsoever, and its autonomization now consists only in this, that exchange value holds itself fast as exchange value, whether it exists in the form of money or in the form of commodity, and only converts into the form of commodity in order to valorize itself. But since, quote, as exchange value can, in general, only become autonomous when confronting the use value that faces it as such, we must know what the use value is that can be productively consumed, and thus oppose itself as use value and exchange value. It is labor, or more exactly, labor power, the only use value which can form an antithesis and say P-I-E-I-U-E-N-T, money, as capital is labor. This is why the content of the use value in this exchange cannot be a matter of indifference. The exchange through which money becomes capital cannot be in the exchange with commodities, but in the exchange with its conceptually determined antithesis, the commodity which is in conceptually determined antithesis to it, labor. So, it is only through the exchange of money with labor that its transformation into capital can take place. The use value with which money, insofar as it is potential capital, can be exchanged can only be the use value from which exchange value itself arises, generates itself, and grows. But this is only labor. Exchange value can be realized as such in only confronting the use value, not this one or that one, but the use value in relation to itself. This is labor. Labor capacity itself is the use value whose consumption immediately coincides with the objectification of labor, thus with the positing of exchange value. For money as capital, labor capacity is the immediate use value for which it must exchange itself in simple circulation. The content of the use value was a matter of indifference. It fell outside the economic form relation, but here it is the latter's essential economic moment. In other words, wage labor is a fundamental characteristic of the capitalist mode of production. Mercantile production was able to dissolve other modes of production, other determined production relations, but still, by itself, it was unable to found a new society, since exchange value preserving itself in exchange is determined by the fact that it is exchanged with the use value that opposes it, according to its own form determination. The real non-capital is work itself. Consequently, capitalism can only fully develop itself when all human labor has become abstract labor. It appears, therefore, that the analysis of the commodity, use value corresponding to concrete labor, is insufficient to explain the transformation of money into capital. Also, the study of the circulation of exchange value has made evident the fact that, to attain autonomy, exchange value must contain within itself a productive phase, in the course of which its opposite, a particular use value, is consumed, productive consumption, and engenders exchange value. Capital can only appear in this way. In capital, money has lost its rigidity, and from a tangible thing has become a process. So it is necessary to determine this process, whose essential moment is immediate production. That is, the process in which the course of which exchange value, and therefore capital, is created, in the course of which there is the productive consumption of labor power. It is here that the results of the immediate process of production, the unpublished 6th chapter of Capital, concludes the study undertaken in the two texts we have analyzed above, and resolves the contradiction posed by the apparent phenomena. Alright, now I'm going to do some notes because I just went over a lot, and that was pretty technical and dense. So I have the basic argument broken down as condensed as possible, mostly through rewriting some quotes. Value can only be understood historically through its forms, as in it can only appear at a certain level of generalization of the mercantile economy. Exchange value progressively becomes the dominant factor, displacing the use value of the products of human activity. The generalization of exchange presupposes a transformation in labor itself, as products progressively lose their characteristic to take on that of being a product of human labor. This is the reduction of concrete labor, which is labor that creates use values, to abstract labor, which is labor that creates value, the social relation that allows a coat to be traded for a specific amount of linen. At this stage, human labor power itself becomes a commodity. The labor power which can sell itself. It is this particular commodity which generates surplus value, the key to value expansion. The essence of capitalism is therefore hidden behind the appearance as a value seems to emerge in circulation. The increase in value is realized in the sphere of circulation, but arises in the sphere of production. Through circulation, value takes on an independent existence as money, the autonomization of exchange value. The existence of exchange value is thus doubled, once as use values, then as money. Money contains a contradiction. It aims to expand, but it is qualitatively limited in contradiction with its quality. Money is capable only of a quantitative movement to increase itself. To overcome this contradiction, value must pass through a phase where use value is consumed productively. Exchange value can only become autonomous as a process, as the commodity must be consumed as use value, but preserved itself as exchange value. Productive consumption, deposit exchange value. This process, the money which re-enters circulation and perpetuates itself and valorizes itself, is capital, value that preserves and expands itself through labor. Capital resolves the contradiction by uniting circulation and production into a self-expanding movement, so as only through the exchange of money with labor that it transforms into capital can take place. In capital, money has lost its rigidity and has become a process. 1. Value cannot remain a thing, money. 2. It must circulate, consume labor power, and reproduce itself. And 3. Therefore, it becomes self-expanding value in motion. Anyways, C. The contribution of the results of the immediate process of production. To understand this process, we must adopt two new distinctions: the labor process, which compromises the frontation of man with the means of production, and the valorization process, which comprises, on one hand, the conservation of value, and on the other hand, the creation of an increase in value, so that instead of value, the value of the variable portion, we now have valorization as a process. The immediate process of production is the unity of the two. These distinctions are to be found throughout Marx's work on economics. For example, in Capital Volume 2, when he criticizes the different theories of fixed capital, or when he deals with the, quote, reproduction and circulation of the total social capital. Moreover, it is here, besides in the results, and also in the Grundrisse, where the concepts are fully developed, that we find the clearest exposition of these two elements of capital's process of production. The immediate production process of capital is the process of labor and valorization, the result of this process being the commodity production product and its determining motive, the production of surplus value. Before continuing, we should make two observations. 1. We indicate in a very suggestive manner the unity of the two processes, without yet knowing of the results. In the Abaco and Capital Volume 1, we represent the immediate process of production as follows, and there's a diagram here of V with 3 lines coming from it. The V is going into V plus S. Also, the original V has V plus C, and then C has an arrow pointing to itself, and then another C, which is V plus S plus C. Okay, he explains it here. V plus C sets out vertically indicating the labor process in capitalist society. The relation between living labor minus variable capital and dead labor minus constant capital. The valorization process indicated in the two horizontal relations. Okay, it's just the valorization process. I'm not very visual. The aspect of the conservation of value advanced in the form of the means of production. B, and that's C to C. B, the aspect of the value creation, which is the V to the V plus S. Evidently, here there is also the conservation of value, since it is necessary first that V is restored before the production of S to take place. Only this aspect is much less important here than in the preceding instance. It is masked by the phenomenon of value creation. 2, there was a labor process in which all modes of production, but as product, were transformed into commodities. Whereas the parallel creation of a valorization process, which assumed increasing importance until capitalism, it supplanted and masked the labor process. Hence the mystification that overcomes the vulgar economists, blinded by the valorization process. Hence also Marx's observation in Capital Volume 1, when at the beginning of this chapter we said in the customary manner that a commodity is both a use value and exchange value, this was, strictly speaking, wrong. I remember when I saw that and I was like, come on, I just understood this. A commodity is a use value or object of utility, and they quote, value. It appears as the twofold thing. It really is as soon as its value possesses its own particular form of manifestation, which is distinct from its natural form. This form of manifestation is exchange value, and the commodity never had this form when it looked at in isolation, but only when it is in a value relation or an exchange relation with a second commodity of a different kind. Once we know this, our manner of speaking does no harm. It serves rather as an abbreviation. There were societies where value did not exist. There will be a society where value will have been destroyed. Communism. But let us return to the immediate process of production. The labor process is a single and indivisible. The work is not done twice over, once to produce a suitable product, a use value, to transform the means of production into products, and a second time to generate value and surplus, to valorize value. The immediate process of production is the indissoluble unity of the labor process and the valorization process. Here, the characteristics, therefore, proceed to the level of production. The process of production is the immediate unity of labor process and valorization process, just as its immediate result, the commodity, is the immediate unity of use value and exchange value. To get a better grasp of this becoming a value that valorizes itself in the course of the production process, two more concepts should be specified: dead labor and living labor. We have seen that to understand circulation, we need to know that every commodity has a use value and an exchange value, corresponding respectively to concrete and abstract labor. To understand the transformation of money into capital, it was necessary to go into the production process, which divides into the labor process, use aspect, and valorization process, exchange aspect. Now, inside this labor process, we must distinguish between the labor that is dead, accumulated, objectified. That is, the means of production that have the character of exchange value, or constant capital. In living labor, labor power of the character of use, which is variable capital. The distinction between objectified and living labor manifests itself in the actual process of labor. Furthermore, in the labor process, objectified labor constitutes an objective factor, an element for the realization of living labor. In this sense, dead labor has a use aspect. Nevertheless, it primarily appears with the determination of exchange value. So this is the becoming. To the extent of which past labor replaces living labor, it itself becomes a process, valorizes itself, it becomes a fluence that creates a fluxion. This absorption into itself of additional living labor is the process of self-valorization, its authentic transformation into capital, into value generating itself, its transformation from a constant amount of value into a variable amount of value in process. Thus, after the definition derived from circulation, we have the one that comes from the production. Capital is objectified dead labor and repeatedly brought back to life by the living labor that it incorporates in a seemingly endless cycle. This is the last definition, including the first provided by the Urtext. Capital as value in process, because now we know that this process comprises, it can only take place by subjugating labor. On the other hand, an existing amount of value, or money, becomes real capital only when firstly, as self-valorizing value, represented as value in process, and this is it achieves when the activity of labor capital, labor, is incorporated in production process and becomes its property. Secondly, it must yield surplus value as distinct from its original value, and this in turn is again the product of the objectification of surplus labor. With the production process, labor is transformed into capital. The material veil is torn aside. The relation between men becomes clear. The relation between capitalists and proletarians with vulgar economists. Ardent defenders of capitalism have every interest in masking, as all their epigons did and still do. However, Marx pushes on still further, and shows that what appears as a thing is still the product of a relation between men. Constant capital is materialized, crystallized, objectified labor, and consequently, The entire process is a traffic between objectified and living labor. The way of considering the transformation of money into capital also explains why Marx, both in the Urtext and the Results, speaks of labor capacity rather than of labor power, as he does in Capital. He is analyzing a process in its becoming, the moment in which the essential transformation is about to take place. It is no accident that he resorts to mathematical terminology in the Results in order to determine the precise instant at which the increase in value will take place and will be able to show its own differential. Thus, he shows that exchange value can only increase itself by exchange with a use value capable of creating value. Later, when the secret of the metamorphosis of money into capital has been quite discovered, it is no longer necessary to present the process in this form. It no longer is a question of capacity, but of given facts, which are realized concretely. What is really consumed is not labor capacity, which stays somewhat potential, but a power. Money is now objectified labor, whether it possesses the form of money or of a particular commodity. No objective mode of being of labor is opposed to capital, but all of them appear as possible modes of existence for it, which it can assume through a simple change in form, going from the money form over to the commodity form. The only antithesis to objectified labor is unobjectified labor, an antithesis to objectifies labor. Subjectified labor, or that labor that is present in time, living in antithesis to labor past in time, but existing in space. As labor that is present in time, unobjectified, and thus also not yet objectified, this can only be present as capacity, possibility, ability as labor capacity of the living subject. Only living labor capacity can form the antithesis to capital, independent objectified labor preserving itself, and so the only exchange by means of which money can become capital is that which the owner of the latter concludes with the owner of living labor capacity, i.e. the worker. As we've already mentioned, this is why Marx adopted the subjective aspect of the starting point in the economic and philosophic manuscripts, the aspect of wage labor. This is in no way contradicts the fact that later, it is capital that tends to appear as the true subject. Marx explains it in the exposé of the mystification of capital. He has thus replied, while moving on the very terrain of his adversaries, certain there can be an increase in value through exchange, but only during one particular exchange, that of objectified labor for living labor. This exchange can only be real when in use value is consumed. It can only be productively consumed, which explains the necessity of an immediate process of production. The result of product requires an exchange in terms similar to the exchanges in the simple circulation of commodities, so that this value can be realized. The contradiction put forward, albeit in a different manner in Capital Volume 1, is thus resolved. The transformation of money into capital has to be developed on the basis of the immanent laws of the exchange of commodities in such a way that the starting point is the exchange of equivalents. The metamorphosis of the money owner into capitalist must and yet must not take place in the sphere of circulation. We saw elsewhere how the same requirement arose in simple circulation. Value must be realized in circulation, but are produced in different spheres. Circulation was realization and materialization of their labor time. In the case of capital, the difficulty lay in the fact that apparently it is a question of explaining, not in equivalence, but rather in non-equivalence. We took circulation as a starting point to show that it posited the realization of something produced in another sphere. The sphere of productivity, but also under the veil, we finally rediscovered the relation between men. This is the same result as arrived at in Capital Volume 1. We found the same procedure in the Grundrisse, explanation of the real movement, the birth of capital from circulation itself. Capital appears right from the start as a quantum of value, a continuous movement. Marx did not want to abstract from the various stages of the movement, to analyze them separately, but wanted rather to show the movement in its totality, with its inherent contradictions, because it asserted itself historically in exactly this way. In Capital, by simplifying the exposition to make a comprehension of the phenomena more accessible, he pauses contradiction right from the start, isolating it from the movement in order to dissect it. In the Grundrisse, we again find the context of the content of the Urtext, although it is less centered on the phenomenon of autonomization. And since this work is the very expression of Marx's thought, we will refer to it again. It integrates, even if in a form that is neither fully developed nor explicit, all the facts of the historical movement which Marx wanted to retranslate in all its complexity. Finally, the product of capital Capitalist production is not value, but surplus value. Hence, the whole difference between circulation in the period of simple commodity circulation and the circulation in the capitalist period. The latter seems to be determined by an exchange between non-equivalent quantities. This explains the new distinction made this time between necessary labor time and surplus labor time. Inside living labor, in the course of the labor process, the proletarian restores the advanced value, which corresponds to his wages, but also creates an additional value during a determined fraction of his working day, the surplus labor corresponding to surplus value. This, moreover, a fully developed reply to the two objections raised by the opponents of the law of value, already indicated by Marx in the contribution. 1. Labor itself has exchange value, and different types of labor have different exchange values. If one makes exchange value the measure of exchange value, one is caught up in a vicious circle, for exchange value used as a measure requires, in turn, a measure. This objection merges into the following problem. Given labor time at the intrinsic measure of value, how are wages to be determined on this basis? The theory of wage labor provides the answer to this. 2. If the exchange value of a product equals the labor time contained in the products, then the exchange value of a working day is equal to the product it yields. In other words, wages must be equal to the product of labor. But in fact, the opposite is true. Ergo, this objection amounts to the problem. How does the production on the basis of exchange value, solely determined by labor time, lead to the result that the exchange value of labor is less than the exchange value of its product? The problem is solved in our analysis of capital. This is precisely what we saw in the study of the immediate process of production, and in particular in the valorization process. The various parts of Marx's work correspond to and complete each other in a vast harmonious unity, where it seems impossible to find a mistake or the slightest contradiction. Thus, the favorite method of our opponents, who want to reduce the work into fragments in the set one against the other in order to find a contradiction that might discredit the whole, has always ended up by exposing their own impotence in understanding the great theory, in which the various elements are in mutual agreement. We again find the same agreement, the same harmony, between the economic and philosophical manuscripts and results. In the latter, Marx decisively investigates the social relation inside the capitalist society and arrives at the following conclusion. Capital is not a thing any more than money is a thing. In capital, as in money, certain specific social relations of production between people appear as the natural social properties of value. The entire socio-economic movement shows that it is not man who dominates, but the object. It is not the worker who buys the means of production and subsistence, but the means of subsistence that buys the worker to incorporate him into the means of production. Man is a commodity. It is the reification of which man speaks in the economic and philosophical manuscripts, in which he will take up again in Capital Volume 3. Production does not simply produce man as a commodity, the human commodity, man in the role of the commodity. It produces him in keeping with this role as a mentally and physically dehumanized being. Immorality, deformity, and dulling of the worker and the capitalist. Its product is the self-consciousness and self-acting commodity, the human commodity. But as we have mentioned, the method is still subjective in the economic and philosophic manuscript. Just as we have derived the concept of private property from the concept of strange alien labor by analysis, so we can develop every category of political economy with the help of these two factors. And we shall find again in each category, e.g. trade competition, capital, money, only a particular and developed expression of these first elements. Marx still lingers too long over the analysis of the superstructure, the forms of property linked only with the alienated labor. Thus, he can define capital as private property in the products of other men's labor, or stored up labor. Definitions like these, however apt, are still too static, and alone do riot permit one to grasp the root of the human alienation. The definition given in the results, falling down the Urtext, capital is value, that valorizes value in process, clarifies and illuminates the entire development of the social production process. There is a certain appropriation of the labor of others, surplus value, by means of the appropriation of the product of living labor, but this has as its purpose the valorization of the value advance. All in all, this results in this reduction of the greater part of mankind abstract labor. This is a consequence of the autonomization of value. However, it is not only a question of showing how the results provide a better explanation of certain facts. We must also show how, as a synthesis, it articulates the whole corpus of Marx's work. Alright, and to conclude here, I will do some notes in this section since it's very dense, so I'm going to try and do notes on all these sections to help explain it and help me as well retain the knowledge. So Marx does not analyze production in abstract, but the dual character of capitalist production. Capitalist production is the unity of the labor process, the production of use values, and the valorization process, the production of surplus value. The transformation of money into capital must and yet must not take place in the sphere of circulation. When one buys something for a set price, they're merely exchanging equal values. Exchange is the mechanism that realizes the magnitude of value enforced upon the producer. The secret of capital is the exchange of objectified labor with living labor. It is only generated by the purchase and consumption of labor power. Capital is not a thing, and by that, that's said a lot, that means it's not like an object in the world. It's not money. It's not means of production. It's value in motion, expanding through labor exploitation. What appears as a relation between things, money or commodities, is actually a relation between classes, capitalists, workers. The magnitude itself is constituted in the act of exchange because that is the only moment that capital, the social form, recognizes its existence. The magnitude is the socially necessary labor time, which is a constant shifting pressure imposed by the world market. The magnitude of value is the form of movement of class struggle, the pressure of the total capital acting on the individual worker to produce more in less time. This is the whole basis of class conflict and the key inside of Marxism.